The Pacific posed new challenges for the U.S., but there was another ocean to deal with. The first English settlers crossed the Atlantic to settle in America in the 1600s, and the ocean had only become more important since then. How was the U.S. supposed to deal with two oceans? The only way to get from one ocean to another was to go around South America, the way Magellan did in the 1500s. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, the Magellan route was still the fastest path between the oceans. A canal would help. A canal is a man-made waterway that connects other waterways. Building a canal through Central America connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would drastically reduce travel time, but this was easier said than done. Britain ran into a similar problem in India. By the end of the 1700s, India was an important part of the British Empire, and the fastest way for them to get there was by rounding Africa, a trip that took several months. This problem was solved with the construction of the Suez Canal in 1869. The canal allowed ships to travel directly between the Mediterranean and Red Seas across the Isthmus of Suez in Egypt. It drastically cut travel time between Europe and Asia. It remains a valuable waterway for commerce even today. But if a canal could be built across the Isthmus of Suez, maybe a canal could be built in Central America. During the early 1800s, the British had designs to build a canal through what is today the country of Nicaragua. But the United States did not trust them. A British canal, right in the Western Hemisphere, America's backyard? This would give the already mighty British Navy a further leg up on the United States, who had no navy to speak of at the time. This was a sensitive issue for the United States. Back in 1823, Spain and some of her European allies threatened to retake the colonies Spain had lost in the Americas. The president at the time, James Monroe, let it be known that this was unacceptable. The Western Hemisphere was off limits to further colonization. This was known as the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. didn't have the power to enforce it, but Europe respected it anyway. Britain's scheme to build a canal through Central America was a threat to the Monroe Doctrine. In 1850, the two countries signed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. They agreed that neither country would build a Central American canal without the consent of the other. It successfully tied Britain's hands and upheld the Monroe Doctrine. By 1900, the shoe was on the other foot. It was the U.S. who now wanted to build a Central American canal. With colonies like Puerto Rico in the Atlantic and the Philippines in the Pacific, it was vital that the U.S. be able to travel quickly between the two oceans. So, in 1901, the U.S. and Britain signed the Hay-Pauncefoot Treaty, which gave the U.S. the right to build and control a canal through Central America. Britain recognized America's special interest in the Americas and respected it, a sign that the U.S. was becoming a serious world power. The only question was, where in Central America would it be built? Nicaragua seemed like the easiest spot. The distance that needed to be dug wasn't that long, and the ground was relatively easy to work with. However, a Frenchman named Philippe Varilla thought differently. He owned a company that had tried to build a canal through Panama, where the distance between the oceans was even smaller than in Nicaragua. However, mountains and disease made this almost impossible for his small company. But if the United States, with its industrial technology, bottomless supply of money, and gigantic workforce, could be convinced to build a canal through Panama, it could be possible. He would also be able to sell his legal rights to a canal zone to them and make a fortune in the process. He would stop at nothing to ensure that the canal would be built in Panama. Roosevelt also wanted a canal, but he wasn't very particular about where it was. He assumed, like most people, that Nicaragua was the most logical place. But Varilla would convince him otherwise. In 1903, a volcano erupted in Martinique, an island nowhere near Nicaragua. Varilla knew Americans were geographically challenged. He sent members of Congress postcards with pictures of Mount Momotumbo in Nicaragua on it, a volcano that hadn't erupted in years. The suggestion was that Nicaragua wasn't a safe place for a canal, because the volcano could blow and destroy everything. Congress got the message and approved the canal through Panama instead. Now that the U.S. had decided on building a canal through Panama, they needed permission from Colombia, who controlled Panama. The two countries negotiated a treaty where Colombia would get $10 million up front and $250,000 annually in return for a 99-year lease on a strip of land in Panama 6 miles wide through which the U.S. would build a canal. Roosevelt considered it a very fair treaty. Colombia's Senate did not, and they rejected it. It's not clear whether Colombia believed they could squeeze more money out of the US or whether they just did not want to give up a chunk of territory for any price. It looked like Roosevelt's and Benavides' dream was dead. But the more Roosevelt thought about it, the more he hated Colombia's government. He called the Colombian Senate a lot of jackrabbits who were blocking the future highway of civilization. He wasn't going to let them stop him from building his canal. Colombia always had a tenuous grasp on Panama. It was separated from the rest of the country by dense jungle. Panamanians had sort of considered themselves different from other Colombians. Felipe Benavides started feeling out whether or not Panamanians might want to fight a revolution against Colombia. He tried to convince important Panamanians to start an independence movement by paying them off and guaranteeing American support. On November 3, 1903, Panamanians declared independence from Colombia. Roosevelt conveniently stationed warships off the coast to ensure Colombia could not land troops there. 3 days later, the United States became the first country in the world to recognize Panama as an independent country. They immediately offered Panama the same canal deal they offered Colombia. Panama wasn't in much of a position to argue, considering how they would need American protection against eventual Colombia. Roosevelt had finally received his canal, but now Varela got the payoff for which he had worked so hard. But controlling a canal in Panama meant the United States had even more of a reason to dominate the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt would ensure that nobody else would be able to threaten the canal zone. Having control of Puerto Rico helped the U.S. guard the approach to the canal, but it wouldn't be enough to totally safeguard it. In 1902, Colombia's neighbor, Venezuela, ran into an issue that required Roosevelt's attention. They were in debt to several European countries, particularly Germany and Britain. Venezuela's president, Cipriano Castro, refused to pay. This was probably unnecessary, since he could have worked with them to defer payments as he had done before. But he was unpopular in his country, and standing up to the major European powers would help his popularity. Castro told Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II that if he wanted his money, he should come to Venezuela and get it himself. Kaiser Wilhelm happily obliged. He and Britain blockaded Venezuela's coast and attacked 2 of their coastal fortifications. President Roosevelt feared they would try to take over all or part of Venezuela, which would violate the Monroe Doctrine. He was particularly mistrustful of Germany, who he saw as an aggressive rising power just like Japan, or the United States. He suggested that Germany and Britain turn the matter over to the International Tribunal at The Hague. Britain and Germany accepted this proposal, and a head-to-head collision with the U.S. was avoided. But Roosevelt knew that something similar would happen in Latin America again, and he was right. In 1903, the Dominican Republic had a revolution. Americans were attacked during the violence. The leader of the Dominican Republic suggested the U.S. step in, maybe even to annex the country. Roosevelt sent in the Navy to protect American lives instead. He took over Dominican customs houses to ensure the DR could repay its debts to Europe while rebuilding its country after the revolution. The U.S. took control of the Dominican Republic without doing so outright. This was a new development in American history. The United States was actively getting involved in Latin American countries facing trouble rather than just stepping in when Europe was looming. This went beyond the Monroe Doctrine. This was the Roosevelt Corollary. Corollary means addition, and the Roosevelt Corollary was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine that claimed the U.S. would get involved in Latin American countries to keep order. This would hopefully keep European countries away. The Roosevelt Corollary would be used dozens of times throughout history as an excuse for the U.S. to interfere with Latin American countries to further their own interests. The Western Hemisphere was undeniably America's realm. Roosevelt was fond of the phrase, "speak softly and carry a big stick." The U.S. would not cause problems, but they were prepared to defend themselves if problems arose. The big stick was the new modern Navy Roosevelt had built, what newspapers called the Great White Fleet for the color of the ships. Towards the end of his presidency, Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet on a tour around the world. It was a way to show the world that the United States had arrived. He was especially sure that Japan and Germany were aware of his new navy, since these were the countries he saw as the U.S.'s future competitors. After his presidency, Roosevelt remained a major advocate for American power around the world. When World War I broke out in 1914, he pressed President Woodrow Wilson to build up the army and fight Germany. He didn't live to see Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, but his vision proved prescient. The countries he saw as America's main competitors, Germany and Japan, ended up being two of our biggest enemies during the 20th century. One of the reasons we were able to beat them was due to Roosevelt's efforts to build the US up into a world power.